The second last conversation you need to have in your first 90 days is known as the style conversation. In the book, The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins, this is what he calls it. But the conversation is really something that I've done before for many years. And it's all about having an open and honest conversation about how you like to communicate and how you want to work with each others. Remember that a common trap is not having effective and irregular communication. Friction often comes inside organizations because we miscommunicate to each others. We either don't communicate enough or the way that we communicate is not effective. And that's often because of the format that we're doing it, or sometimes even that the way that we're communicating is not that person's preferred mechanism. I'll give you an example of what I mean. How many times have you communicated something, perhaps maybe in a Slack message or a post or an email, and people have not read it? Days later, people are asking you the exact same questions that you communicated out. And it's really frustrating because you're thinking, well, I keep sending it out, I keep communicating it, but why aren't people reading it? Why aren't they getting the message? But there's another question within it, which is if you did send it out and you sent it out multiple times, why didn't they read it? And if they did read it, why didn't that information sink in? You need to almost unpack why that is the case. And sometimes the answer is the medium and how it was communicated. The reality is we can't change how people want to work themselves, but what we can control is how we go about adapting to their style. So you can't change how a stakeholder wants to be communicated with. You can't change whether they read your email or not. But what you can do is change the format and whether email is even the best format to communicate with them in the first place. So this is where the style conversation comes in. The goal of the style conversation is to understand and align your preferred communication style to theirs. So this is a two-way street. It involves asking them, whether that be your manager, the team, or stakeholders, a few questions around how they prefer to communicate and engage with you. And you want to do the same as well. Like I said, it's a two-way street. You want to also give them some expectations on how you like to be communicated with and what you expect from them. You would have already done some of this to a smaller scale as part of your relationship backlog. And when you did start to talk to people as part of that, you know, when I talked about seeding the way and proposing a way that you wish to maintain a relationship with them, remember that could have been regular one-on-ones or a regular format, even Slack messages or emails. What you're doing here is a small version of the style conversation. You're starting to look at how you want to maintain that relationship and try to understand what works for them. Does the way that you proposed it match to their style? And if it doesn't, you can start to adjust from there. The style conversation is just taking this one step further, going deeper. It's about thinking about your whole working relationship with that person as an example. When you start to look at the whole, there are many different things that we need to align on in terms of style. We need to start to think about how do we want to keep each other's updated. That could have been regular one-on-ones, but it could be like week notes, like a summary at the end of the week, or it could be a Slack message, or it could even just be shadowing or coming along. Or they might not want to be kept updated. They trust you and they're like, no, I'm cool as long as you're happy, just flag with me when you have issues. You also want to look at how do they prefer to be contacted. Do they prefer an email, a Slack message, even a phone call? Do they prefer a tap on the shoulder if you're working in person? And which brings me to a whole new dynamic that we have today, which is about hybrid and flexible working. You may need to decide on things like, what are your core working hours? You know, what's flexible and what's not? When are you expected to be online? What days are you coming into the office? What days are you not? If you are coming into the office, are we trying to do those regular meetings and those one-on-ones in person, or are we happy to keep them virtually? I had a really recent example of how the style conversation can be effective. I was working with a VP of product. This was about a year or two ago. They're at a scale-up AI company, and his team, the directors of product, had been really struggling to influence the C-suite. And they found that really between the two co-founders was where the friction was lying. We spent some time unpacking the problem space and starting to understand what was going on with the two founders. And what we found was they had very different communication styles. One preferred things to be documented, written down. He really liked depth, words on a page. He wanted to, sit down and read it thoroughly ahead of time. He would always take a Word document over a PowerPoint deck if he had the choice. The other founder was the complete opposite. He was a visual type of person and he found words to be overbearing. He would take the PowerPoint deck, not the Word document. He preferred to be shown something, a visual, a diagram, a actual prototype, a demo, and visual presentations really worked with him. The friction, it turned out, was that what we were seeing in the situation was we'd pick one type of style based on the feedback, and we really were sitting on this kind of seesaw. We'll get feedback and we'll tip it over to be more wordy, and then the other one didn't like it. We'll get more feedback, we'll tip it back to being more visual, and the other one didn't like it. And we're really struggling to find a style that suited both of them. And we either found one that suited one, but didn't suit the other, and vice versa. By unpacking the problem space and really trying to understand this realization led the VP of product to have a style conversation with both of them and agree going forwards how they would actually communicate to the C-suite and to each others. And what we landed on was basically a mixed style of communication. We would make sure that things contained a sufficient level of detail and was sent ahead of time for one of the founders and those in the C-suite who preferred that, while still having and maintaining a visual style presentation that had things like demos and prototypes in it. And we're really trying to appease both sides. But just a really good example of how it can be effective and how something that you're struggling with, particularly around influence, can almost boil down and come down to something as simple as the way and the medium that we were communicating and how we're going about that. So when should you have the style conversation? Ideally, you want to have this conversation sooner rather than later. I put this here in Sprint 2, not because you can't have it in Sprint 1, but because typically we're still really new during Sprint 1. And I like to reserve that space to really meet key people, learn as much as possible, and to begin to establish those relationships and not go too deep in these types of conversations. But once you've done all that, you can begin to have the style conversation at any moment, whether that's midway through or in the latter part of Sprint 1 or your first month, or whether that's in Sprint 2 in your second month. That's really up to you. I also put it here in Sprint 2 because I think this is your last responsible moment. Like, I wouldn't be leaving it much later than your second month into a job. And third month may be okay, but you're really starting to push it then, because by that stage, you would have had to engage with these people frequently and regularly already. And if you're not having the style conversation, you might be doing it in a suboptimal way, in an ineffective way, which is actually going to be detrimental to your relationships with those people and your ability to influence them in the future. It's also going to have a detrimental effect on your competency. Again, remember that this Sprint 2 is all focused on building that credibility, showing that you're competent, and helping the later foundation to build trust in Sprint 3. And if we don't have the style conversation and we are misaligned in styles, that can really actually work against us and damage us as opposed to actually helping us and propelling us forwards. So who should we be having this style conversation with? Unlike the other conversations where they're more targeted towards your direct manager or one or two key stakeholders, this is going to have a much more broader net. And this is because anyone you need to work with regularly and communicate with regularly, you should be having a style conversation with. This means not just considering your core stakeholders, but also those direct stakeholders too, and maybe potentially the indirect ones in that latter field, but I'd probably leave them to the side. Because if you're communicating or working with people regularly, you want to make sure that you're doing that in an effective way. So you want to have this conversation, and this is all part of effective stakeholder management. Just ensuring that the way we communicate is in the best possible medium, best possible format for the people and our audience that we're communicating to. That's really what we want to do. So if you're thinking about who, just really think about anyone you need to build a relationship with, anyone you're communicating with regularly or working with regularly. That's really the people you should be having this conversation in some shape or form, whether it's in a very lightweight version or if it's very in-depth like you should with your direct manager. So let's talk about how that conversation looks like. At the end of the day, the style conversation is really just an open conversation. It's an open conversation between two or more people about how we like to communicate with each other, our own styles of working, and really trying to create some understanding, some empathy, and some alignment around that. Personally, I like to start this conversation by leading it. I like to lead by example and to discuss how I like to be communicated with. It's a great way to start the conversation, especially for stakeholders who have never had this conversation before. They don't know what it looks like. So you can kind of demonstrate a little bit about what you're expecting and what you're hoping to understand from them. So what I often start with is I start to set my own expectations about my own working style and communication style. One example of that is that I typically, and I often have to set this expectation, is that I check emails twice a day. Once in the morning and then once in the evening. So my preferred style of being contacted, especially during the day, is via Slack or direct message, depending on their communication tool, like Teams or whatever it may be. So if you're trying to contact me during the day via email, that is not the best way to try and contact me, because I block my time. So I try and do emails in the morning and then emails in the evening, and then I try and leave it at that. I also like to set the expectation that I have a preference for asynchronous communication. So rather than trying to call me or try and ping me or something like that and expect me to reply straight away, I prefer communication to be asynchronous. So if you're going to ping me, please write up what you expect or what you're hoping to ask me or have a conversation about. So then when I do read it, I can then come back more pointed. I also like to set this expectation because asynchronous communication helps me structure my own day, especially as someone who works with many different clients and have many different businesses and different things going on. It just becomes much easier to be able to balance my day and structure it if things are asynchronous, because I can read it, I can get to it in my own time, and I can shuffle things around. But even if you're not like me, asynchronous communication can help a lot. And I talk more about this in my communication courses, but asynchronous can help because, especially if you're in and out of meetings, or if you want to block time out to really focus on something like synthesizing some research or working on a strategy or those types of things, asynchronous can really just help you structure your day. So trying to set that expectation up front can help. You get more asynchronous communication, less interruptions, and you can structure your day better. From there, once I've set some expectations about how I like to work, how I like to communicate, and my own communication style, I typically start to lead this conversation to key moments where I need to work with that individual or communicate with them. So a perfect example of that would be my direct manager and having a weekly one-on-one. So I'll lead the discussion to be about our one-on-one, and I'll start to lead it to be how would we like to have that one-on-one? Should it be in person? Or should it be virtual? Or doesn't matter? We can just play it by ear. Should it be, like, what format should it be in? Is it going to be really formal, and are we going to have a set agenda? Or is it going to be very casual? Maybe we'll go grab a coffee and go for a walk or something like that. What would they like to cover in it? Like, what are the key things that they would like to cover? What would I like to cover? Those types of questions. That's how I would then lead the conversation. This then acts as a really good starting point to then broaden the conversation to cover more aspects of how we like to work together and communicate with each other. I'll take it from there and start to ask more open-ended questions like, how do you want to stay up to date about what I'm working on? Is our one-on-ones enough, or do we need something additional? If I need to escalate something to you, how would you like me to reach out to you? If it was something urgent, how would you like me to reach out to you? Then you'll be surprised. Sometimes they'll say, just call my mobile. Here's my mobile number, or don't, or do something else, right? And then, what format is best? Maybe I'll ask some questions about what would you expect to see in it? So if I had a need, an escalation, what would you expect? What would you expect of me before I came to you with that escalation? Remember that this is just an open conversation. It can be fluid and flexible. You may even need to have this conversation again in a couple of months, especially if you find that something's not working. So that's something to look out for. If you feel like your communication with a stakeholder or a manager is just not working, messages aren't landing, then definitely come back and revisit this conversation. Come back, have a look at it, work out, do I need to have this conversation again, and maybe have it again. It's also worth refreshing sometimes if things get a bit astray. Like I actually have to do this quite regularly. You know, I'm getting emails in the middle of the day. I'll have to reset that expectation to say, hey, my personal style is that I check emails in the morning, check emails in the afternoon. If you want to get into contact with me during the day and it's urgent, please try and message me, hit me up on chat as opposed to emailing. And then obviously this is also a negotiation. If the way that you like to communicate doesn't match with theirs, it's basically a negotiation to be able to say, well, okay, how might we meet in the middle here? So let it be flexible, let it be more of a negotiation. It's really just an open conversation, and definitely try and lead it with yourself and how you want to communicate. And that's it. That's the style conversation. An open-ended conversation with two or more people about how they like to be communicated with each other. You may need to have this conversation with your manager, key stakeholders, your team, anyone who you're going to regularly communicate with, need to influence or work with. This conversation is super important as it can set you up for success in terms of being able to influence them and to make sure that we're communicating effectively and the messages that we're sending out is landing and that we're actually being able to communicate effectively within the organization. Remember as well that this is also a critical piece of the puzzle to making sure that we are seen as competent and we are seen as competency in our job. And that credibility is going to translate over later into trust. So we don't want to erode that and work against us. We need to make sure that we're communicating effectively now so we can build that foundation.